Good afternoon, the subscribers of the Global Energy Association. This is, I think, our 7th or 8th consecutive chats with the authors of relevant chapters of our new book, which is called The 10 Breakthrough Ideas for the Next 10 Years in Energy. And today we have someone who surprisingly has not participated in these chats so far, Rodney Allam from the UK, Nobel Prize winner. As a humble taxpayer, I can only say hello, sir.
Well, hello to you.
Your theory and your chapter is about the carbon capture. What are we talking about here?
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
Yes.
Carbon capture.
Yes, what is it?
Carbon capture is simply the method of removing carbon at a primary source so that there isn't any pollution of the atmosphere. People do look at taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but the concentration is so low that the costs would be prohibitive. And in any case, Mother Nature does a much better job at that than we can possibly aspire to. So we have to really re-engineer our energy production systems in order to produce energy without any emission to the atmosphere. Why? Because if we look at our environment, the air we breathe is the most fragile part of our environment. It's a layer which only imposes a pressure of 1 kilogram per square centimeter roughly on each surface of the Earth. And that shows what a very tiny amount of gas there is really in the atmosphere and how easy it is for mankind's activities, which are basically energy directed, and energy is the primary source of man's whole industrial environment. So the pollution that we have experienced over the last 100 to 200 years is a direct result of the expansion of our civilization. We've come to a crossroads and we have to take a path which cleans up our atmosphere. That's the most important thing we can possibly do at the present time. We have pressures on the land, we have pressures on the sea, but the atmosphere is this tiny shell that surrounds us and provides us with life. And it's being polluted at a gross rate. And of course, the effects of this pollution are becoming obviously much more serious than we had anticipated, even as little as 10 or 15 years ago. And your own country, Russia, is one example where the heating in the Siberian area is grossly higher than what was predicted a few years ago, and has caused immediately some quite drastic changes to begin to take place. Forest fires, emission of methane from the permafrost and from trapped methane. All of these things are going to cause even worse pollution in the atmosphere in the future. So we have a task. We have to re-engineer really our entire energy production system, and we also have to re-engineer the way we use energy and the way we produce the basic goods we need for our way of life, which is plastics, chemicals, and any other manufactured processes. So we have a vast task in front of us. And we have to address that in a piecemeal fashion, but all of these things have to move in parallel. So I addressed in the chapter I wrote a couple of the more important areas, which is power production and transportation. But I also drew attention to the necessity of making our major manufacturing systems, particularly chemicals, petrochemicals, carbon-free if we could possibly achieve that. And of course, there are some tremendous fallout advantages once we start that process. For example, in towns, cleaning up our transportation system will remove particle and other chemical pollutants such as NOx and hydrocarbons, which are already causing huge amounts of medical problems and lots of death rates in major cities. particularly in the Far East, in China, for example.
Ah, good. Let me interrupt you here. Firstly, a very unexpected question. Do you speak Japanese?
No.
Neither do I, so I'm actually confused. Is it Sakura or Sakura, which is the right pronunciation? Anyway, we're talking about the cherry trees, which are grown by the Japanese, and they appreciate them blooming, and they sit in front of them contemplating. Now, when I was making a documentary several years ago about the Japanese energy system, we filmed a coal energy plant station in Japan, under which sakuras, whatever, are blooming, which is a sign that the environment is absolutely safe and clean. I was amazed, so I asked our Japanese friends, how come? Because typically, you would have a 2-3 miles around this station where nothing happens and nothing lives. And they told me, yeah, of course, they filtered. This is roughly what we're talking about here, and this is an obvious example. But then when they mentioned the price tag, and I'm afraid I can't even remember, but we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of investment.
Oh yeah, that's just sulfur removal.
Yeah. Things become clear. So, well, we may fantasize about the application of such technologies, even in Europe, not to mention the developing world, saying, well, the Japanese, of course, the tidiest nation on this planet. Now, your technology has been around for many years now, but it hasn't been used as frequently as it should. What's the problem?
The problem is that at the moment, there's no imperative for a power company to use a carbon-free system. There aren't sufficient penalties and there aren't sufficient diktats from government to compel power companies to do other than sit and do what they've done in the past. Secondly, many of the power companies were running with coal-fired systems, as you've just mentioned. And one of the big steps they can make is simply go to natural gas, which removes about 60% of the pollutants per kilowatt of power. So they can make the argument that they can still use carbon, but they won't go to the full 100% removal. That's really the next step. The other point is that there are 2 countries in the world, well, and a number of countries in Southeast Asia, that's India and China and the countries in Southeast Asia, who have to use coal because they have extremely large populations which are growing at a rapid rate, and many of those people have no power at all. So if a government has to choose between pollution-free power and actually providing primary power for their population, they're going to choose to provide the primary power first and deal with the population's requirements before they go to pollution-free power. And they can postpone any action at all. So if you look at the statistics, then the contribution of India, China, and Southeast Asia are predominantly the cause of the continuing increase in CO2 emissions. Now the problem really is compounded by the fact that if you look, I looked a year or so ago at the number of planning applications in China for major power stations burning coal, and there were 258 planning applications which have been actually given the first stage approvals. And I attended a big IEA meeting in Paris 2 years ago in the foreign ministry, actually. It's the IEA management meeting. And a lot of the meeting was about the imperative in Southeast Asia to build power stations for the populations. And of course, these are relatively small power stations, therefore more polluting. But the whole population, as you well know, is scattered around the edges of the islands, of the major islands. And there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of them, so that there is a whole proliferation of small power stations going into Southeast Asia, virtually all coal-fired. So you've got this situation that it's difficult to see how we can reduce the CO2 emissions that we have at the moment, given the trajectory which is already built into the system. So what we have to do is we have to produce technology which will enable new stations to be built which are pollution-free as the older stations become redundant. And since a coal-fired station has a life of 40 to 50 years, we can look for the first stations to be built in the next 5 or 10 years, and for the progression of this system to go on for at least 50 years after that. So we won't really get this problem properly under control, I don't think, until the latter part of the 21st century.
There's another angle to that. Yeah, there's another angle to that. Pollution is pollution. And in fact, for a lot of people who are listening to us now, and a lot of our subscribers are actually from the developing world, Asia, Latin America. I specifically mentioned Latin America because Colombia is a coal-producing country, of course, and Africa are listening to us now saying, okay, right, we don't know anything about the climate change. It may affect us, it may not affect us, but we know about pollution. So, you know, carbon capture is about capturing pollution as well. However, there's another angle, and that is about people who not just burn the coal, but they also produce it. If you look at countries like Colombia, which I've mentioned, Indonesia, Australia, Poland, and also, of course, Russia, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs. Yeah. Speaking in an old-fashioned way, we may be exaggerating. To be honest with you, until recently, I thought that we still in Russia have about 1.5 million people involved directly in the coal industry. This is not the truth any longer. 150,000. There are only 150,000 miners left in this country, and they, interestingly, produce 150% more of coal than they used to do in the Soviet times, when there were those 1.5 million, 2 million people. So the efficiency of the industry is growing, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs and a lot of families depending on it. So you've got a bit of a vicious circle. You've got to keep jobs on the one hand, especially after the pandemic. On the other hand, you've got to cut the pollution. And if we had three hands, on the third hand, from the point of view of these people I'm talking about now, you've got to be thinking about the climate change, etc. Where is the healthy compromise between the interests of the trade unions, coal producers, coal burners, and the totality of the humankind?
My opinion is that the only answer is for us to provide powerful technology which can supersede the simple burning of coal to produce
and
heat.
Affordable technology, I should add.
It has to be affordable, it has to be high efficiency, and it has to interface with the most modern power systems. Now, what that means is you have to take the coal and convert it into a convenient gaseous fuel. That's what it really boils down to. And there are a number of processes available to do this. And actually, in Russia, you've developed, and I work here with the Institute of Thermophysics in Novosibirsk, and we developed a method of burning coal by reaction with water at intermediate temperatures, which produces gases, which you can then use in a gas turbine or in one of my CO2 cycles. So the most, I hate to say this, but one of the most efficient ways you can do this is to gasify the coal in a highly efficient manner and then use the coal gas that's produced in one of the new power cycles which use CO2 as the working fluid. And that produces CO2-free power because the CO2 is produced as a byproduct, as pure gas, which you can dispose of. Now in Russia, there are a number of very excellent places where you can dispose of CO2. You can even get benefits from injecting the CO2 into the oil fields to produce oil over a longer period and more efficiently. because there's no way in which we can stop using hydrocarbons. If we go down to a more granular level, there's been a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy and tremendous success in the production of power from wind and solar. But when you look at the amount of power that we need and the flexibility which we need to use power, there's no way that renewables can do the whole job. In fact, you need a much more balanced system with renewables, with nuclear, but a very large amount for the next 100 years will be fossil fuels, which will be burnt in an efficient manner and consumed to produce power with cycles such as the CO2 cycle, which will automatically give you clean energy by simply producing the CO2 as a high pressure byproduct, as a pure CO2 form that you can dispose of easily. So the pathway is there. And there is another parallel pathway that we must follow. And this is the pathway towards hydrogen. And this is really key to the transportation system. At the moment, the world seems to be totally obsessed with going for battery power. But when you buy a battery powered car, you buy a car without an engine. There's no engine in the car. You buy a storage cell, and the engine is the power station, which is producing the energy. Now in America, for example, in the US, the amount of carbon that's emitted from vehicles exceeds the amount of carbon that's generated in the whole of their power system. So concentrating on power is only half the problem. In fact, there are 4 problems you've got. One is power, one is transportation, one is chemicals and petrochemicals and manufacturing processes which emit CO2. And the fourth one, which everybody seems to forget, is that in most of the world, we're using fossil fuel to heat our buildings and commercial systems and our private houses. So we are actually consuming a huge amount of energy and emitting enormous pollution as individuals. And of course, that's a very difficult problem to handle, because we're talking in the UK, for example, of maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 million dwelling homes, all of which are emitting CO2 in one form or another. So those are the problems, the 4 things that we have to look at. And hydrogen can deal with that last problem by replacing natural gas in pipelines with hydrogen or hydrogen-nitrogen mixtures, and having no pollution when you burn in your gas-fired boiler, or as a transportation fuel. And one of the advantages of hydrogen is that you can centralize production in a very efficient plant which removes 100% of the carbon from the hydrocarbon feedstock as CO2. And you can make these plants efficiently, cheaply, at a very large scale, so they're not environmentally unfriendly. And the hydrogen will be the transportation mode of the future. I think electric generation systems in cars are interchangeable between battery and hydrogen power. You replace the battery with a fuel cell. The trouble is you've got to develop a hydrogen distribution system. The production is okay, the use is okay, but the bit in the middle, the transportation and distribution, hydrogen is a pig of a gas to try and distribute, because it's very, very low density as a liquid. It's very low density as a gas. It has a limited calorific value, but it is super clean. So we'll need bigger pipelines. We'll need some liquid distribution systems, and these can be made cheaply by using refrigeration from LNG revaporization. You can use that energy to help you liquefy the hydrogen, so you can build up a system with a pipeline system and a liquid hydrogen distribution system to hold the transportation.
Let me tell you this. Hydrogen is something to which at least a couple of chapters of this new book are dedicated. And if you are not familiar with some of the Russian wording, I can tell you that what you've been talking about is, in Russian terms, honey to your soul. Someone from a fossil producing country is they, listens to you, and I just, I thought I have a person now. Yes, it is true that we will not be able to establish a stable energy supply with non-conventional sources for at least 50 years. You said 100, and I quote you. Yet, I must be provocative. The members of our association pay me to be provocative, and I'll ask that question. Where do you store the CO2 which you capture?
Well,
you've mentioned, yes, you've mentioned underground facilities, but I've been traveling the world, and there are places where you can do it easily. But you mentioned Siberia. Siberia, Western Siberia, is not a problem whatsoever. There are empty oil fields to which you can easily pump the CO2. But as far as Eastern Siberia is concerned, where in fact the coal, the hated coal, is produced, has got some empty coal mines, but other than that, I can't really envisage a place to which you can pump CO2 captured by these new marvelous technologies you've been talking about. So what do we do? What do we do there?
Well, you have to look to the petroleum engineers who know the location of saline aquifers.
Do they?
Oh yes. Now, for example, I'll give you an example. In the middle of the North Sea and going up right to the North Cape, there's a huge aquifer called the Utsira Formation.
Nordkapp in Norwegian, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's quite a ways down. I think it's about a couple of 1,000 meters down. The salinity is very, very high, about over 20% salt. It's capped. The rock is capped. That structure is capped, and they've been injecting around 1 million tons a year, as you know, since about 1990, 1995, somewhere around there. And they did it because the Norwegian government slapped a tax on offshore CO2 emissions, and it was attractive to process a new gas find which had 7% CO2 in it. Rather than let that gas off and pay a huge tax, they decided to re-inject the gas into this structure. It's been incredibly successful. There's another one in North Africa that BP did in Algeria. And these injections have been very heavily instrumented to check on the way in which the CO2 bubble expands through the formation. And they've also been able to show that the cap rock is actually chemically modified by CO2 plus the salt water, so that it forms a more impervious layer. So once you put it down there, with the temperature and the pressure that exists at that sort of depth, you can store an enormous amount of CO2 per cubic meter of water. And
are you talking about a new industry? So that, for instance, Europe, what's left of the European Union after Brexit, of course, I haven't said that. So Europe captures all of the CO2 coming out of the old-fashioned chimneys, collects it, and then transports it on the new tankers to, say, North Africa, to store it. That's how it's going to work.
No, they could transport it to the North Sea and inject it into existing or depleted gas wells. They could use it for enhanced oil recovery, because CO2, when it's used for enhanced oil recovery, is not a continuous flow. It's never used continuously. It's a technique called WAG, water and gas. You inject the CO2 for a period, and then you follow it with water, and then you inject again and follow it with water. So in other words, you can either put the thing into it, you can either drill wells into the aquifer
Yeah,
and
okay.
put the CO2 into the aquifer. You can put it into depleted gas wells in the North Sea, or you can use it for enhanced oil recovery. Now, the other thing to remember is that CO2 can be liquefied very easily. If you compress CO2 to about 75 bars, and then just cool it with atmospheric temperature and let it through a valve, just let it down through a valve, it will form something like 60% liquid and 40% vapor. And you let it down to a pressure of about 6 bars. CO2 goes solid at about 5.5 bars pressure. It goes straight from gas to solid. So you have to keep it above that so-called critical point, the triple point it's called, where gas, solid and liquid coexist in equilibrium. If you're above that at about 6 bars, you'll make liquid, and then you simply recycle that 40% back into the compressor. So you can very cheaply liquefy, so you don't have to produce gas in a pipeline and pay billions for 2,000, 3,000 mile pipelines. You can actually produce it as liquid. Now in the UK, we're very lucky in having a long coastline with most of our industrial concentration and urban concentration is not too far from the sea. So in the UK, we can plan to liquefy the CO2 and ship it out in tankers. And there are even places in the Middle East, and this won't last forever, who would buy the CO2 to inject into their oil wells. And if even at the price of 40, 45 bucks a barrel, it's still attractive to inject CO2 for recovering oil. And that's done in the States. At the moment, they inject well over 20 million tons of CO2 a year into oil wells in America. So this technique has been established and been used for the last 30 or 40 years. So there's plenty of history in the industry. It's a very safe method. So it actually has another effect, is that it shows that the integrity of these injection systems is very high. In other words, the number of times there's been huge ejections of CO2, that's really never happened in America.
Yeah.
They might get a bit of leakage, but there's been no safety or massive ejections of CO2, which is what a lot of people worry about.